Alright guys, let's pick up where we left off in the last video. We're looking at qualitative inquiry and specifically the instruments in qualitative inquiry. Whenever we're talking about quantitative designs, you'll notice that a lot of the quantitative designs talk about instruments in terms of how what you use to collect your data. So maybe it's a certain scale or a certain survey or something that you use to measure. When we're talking about an instrument in qualitative research, what we usually mean is the tool that we are using to guide our investigation. That may be an interview guide, which would be a list of the questions that you look to ask. It may be an observation protocol with all the things that you're looking for. A lot of the times it might just be a blank sheet of paper if you're doing observations and you're just taking field notes of what you see out in the field. So a lot of times that term instrument is a little tricky in qualitative research. For the most part, if you hear me talk about a qualitative instrument, I'm going to be talking about something like a guide that you're using to guide your observations, or maybe a list of questions that you're using in an interview. I also want to talk about the idea of the researcher as instrument in that you are collecting everything. So in quantitative designs, for example, let's say I want to know how much somebody weighs. If I put them on a scale, that scale is my instrument and it tells me how much they weigh. If I'm doing a qualitative study where I want to talk to them about how weight has had an impact on their lives, then my instrument, which I developed, is now what's being used. So instead of something that has no consciousness, like a physical scale or a tape measure, now I'm the instrument who is sharing this information. Likewise, I'm also the instrument of analysis. So not only am I what is recording data, but I'm also what's going to analyze data. So in quantitative research, our last module, we talked a lot about, in the readings especially, they discussed different types of statistical tests that you would run depending on the type of data that you have. So for example, if I'm collecting data for a weight loss program and I want to see if my independent variable, my treatment, has an effect on people's weight. The scale, like the physical scale that measures weight, is what's going to measure the weight. And then a program like SPSS, which is what we use in our statistical courses here. There are others, but think of it as just kind of a fancy Excel program for those of you who haven't had stats yet. And so the scale that they step on measures their weight. And then the SPSS program, I put that data in that the scale gave me, and then SPSS, I tell it which equation to run, essentially, what test to run, and then it gives me some feedback. And then there are clear-cut rules about that feedback. If it's over a certain value, we look at something called a p-value for those of you who have not taken stats yet, and it's okay, you don't need stats for this course, and I will not ask you this on the exam. But we have something that we look at as a p-value that we get out of most statistical tests. And we decide if that test has significance or not based on if that p-value is above or below a certain number. So it's very black and white. Is the p-value above 0.05? Our findings are not significant. Is it below 0.05? Our findings are not significant. If you don't need to know the statistics of it, so I hope that p-value didn't throw anybody off who isn't in statistics or hasn't taken it yet. What I want you to take away from that is that there are clear-cut rules. The scale gives me a weight. I put the weight into the computer program. The computer program gives me a number, and there are clear-cut rules about how I interpret that number. If the number is this, I say yes. If the number is this, I say no. In qualitative inquiry, it gets a little more complicated because we are the ones who are collecting that data. So the scale isn't giving me a number. I'm watching people and I'm writing down a certain number, right? So I'm collecting that data, and I'm also the one that's analyzing that data. So I am the SPSS, I am the computer. The trouble we run into is in qualitative research, and I'm using trouble very lightly. For some people it's considered a problem, for other people it's considered a benefit of qualitative research. But one of the limitations, let's say, of qualitative research is that if we're in a classroom and all of you are sitting down in front of a computer, and I give you a formula to put into SPSS or Excel, and I give you the values that go into that formula, and you run that test, we would all get the same answer, correct? So if I asked everybody, just those of you who are sitting at home right now listening to this video, if I asked you what is the answer to 2 plus 2, everybody is going to tell me 4, or everybody should tell me 4, unless they're going into some kind of existential discussion of what do numbers mean, but that would make it more qualitative. So for the purposes of the quantifiable side, the quantitative side, 2 plus 2 equals 4, and we can all agree that if we had that data set, we would have all come with the same conclusion if we ran the same test. In qualitative research, we're not always going to come up with that same conclusion. So our data would be those numbers in the statistics example I just gave you. In another example where maybe we wanted to see what is it like to live with a terminal illness, that would be a qualitative study. I go out and I collect interviews about this. The interviews, their words, those transcripts are now my data. I share that with several different people. And I ask them, what is it like to live with a terminal illness? Everybody is going to give me slightly different answers to that, right? Can you see how that would happen? So different people are going to tell me, well, it's lonely. Or another person might tell me, oh, I read this and my takeaway from this is that it's stressful. And so I would get all these different responses of lonely and stressful and hard and hopeless and all of these types of terms that would come out of that. I would get all of that from individuals versus if I would have asked them a question like 2 plus 2, where everybody would have given me the same answer. So that element of us being the instrument, of the researcher being the instrument, means that we all might see something slightly different. It also means that what we see is going to be kind of colored by our experiences. So if I have had a terminal illness or known somebody who has a terminal illness, I might read that document a little differently than someone who hasn't. If it is we do this a lot with researchers in our building, we'll have interview data about healthy lifestyle behaviors and hindrances or barriers to living a healthy lifestyle. And people from the education departments will hear the research and they'll read the interviews and they'll see education related topics in there, that it's a lack of awareness or a lack of information. Other folks in nutrition, for example, what they see in it is it's a lack of resources. These families don't have healthy food, or there's not a lot of options for healthy food. Somebody in sociology or economics might say they don't have enough money to afford this food, to live this healthy lifestyle. So money is the problem. We don't want to say that any one of those is correct or wrong. We just want to see how many possibilities we have. So that subjectivity helps you see something that maybe somebody else wouldn't see. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong, right? So whenever we're comparing the two, there's more subjectivity in qualitative research than there is in quantitative, but that subjectivity isn't necessarily inherently a bad thing. So with the researcher as an instrument, you are the tool by which your participant is measured and assessed, and you're a participant observer. That means you're engaging with your participants. How that differs from quantitative is, for example, I can send out a survey. I'm sure many of you have seen those surveys in the hallway or on the bulletin boards where it will have a phone number that you can text or maybe a QR code you can scan. Several of you have probably gotten them in your courses before, right? If you don't have any experience with those, think about the IDEA evaluations that you do in class, right? That's collecting quantifiable data. They're asking you these survey questions on a scale, right, to rate people on a scale. So you, in quantitative, you could do an entire study and never see, never meet, never engage with the people who are in your study. You might, if you're doing a treatment and you're measuring it yourself, there's a possibility that you could meet these people, but it's also a possibility that you could go through the entire study never knowing who was in your study. They completed an anonymous survey. You have no idea who they are. Even if you wanted to know, you couldn't find out. There is no interaction at sometimes in quantitative research. Qualitative, on the other hand, this concept of participant observer, you are required to be in direct connection with the people who are in your study. We cannot promise anybody in qualitative research anonymity because there's so much content we get from them, often by talking to them in person, that we cannot ever tell them, like, you will be anonymous. There is a chance that I know who you are. I know you participated in this study, so it's not anonymous. However, we can maybe keep it confidential where we don't share your name or your information with people. But that engagement does come with some limitations in the sense that you get close to your participants. And that has potentially some type of effect on you collecting your data and analyzing your data. On the other side, because you get close to your participants and you're in that actual environment, you may do a better job of analyzing that data than if you weren't there because you understand the context a little bit better. So that idea of being a participant observer strictly means that you're engaged with the individuals that are participating in your study. They're not clicking an anonymous survey link somewhere, at least not usually. The ideal is that you're engaging with them one-on-one. And there could be, just like in the previous one about the researcher being the instrument, in this one there's the pros and cons of it. So the pros, of course, are you get to know these individuals and you might understand their experience better. The cons are we get to know them and sometimes we have to make sure that we're not letting that affect us as a researcher. And so the final part of this definition is naturalistic inquiry. It's a fancy phrase to basically say you are studying something in its natural environment. So in quantitative research, we're trying to control for all of those extraneous variables, right? We want to limit as many of them as we possibly can because that gives us greater internal validity. Looking at those threats to validity, you noticed how having a control group was one of the answers for controlling threats to internal validity the most. So we want to control for those as much as we can. That's what we want, and that serves our purposes in an experimental design. However, in qualitative research, we want to kind of collect all that messiness of the context, right? I want to, if I'm studying a group of kids at a school and their test scores, and I want to understand, what it's like to be a student at that school, I don't want to just look at their test scores. I want that information because it's valuable to me, but that's not the only information that I want. I want to spend some time at the school. I want to see what the culture of the school is like, what the morale of the students and the teachers is like. What does the school look like? Is it welcoming? All of these types of things, the messiness of those details are going to become very important to me in understanding and setting up the context of that situation. And part of the reason why it's okay for me to do that when it was something that was considered a bad thing in the quantitative piece was that I'm not trying to generalize to the broader population. I want to do my best job to tell the story of this particular school that I'm studying. I'm not trying to say that this is something that's going to help student literacy scores. This is something that's going to help people lose weight across the country. That's not my goal at all. I want to say that this is this particular group of people's experience, and through their experience, we can learn something, right? Anytime your grandparents or your parents ever told you a story, kind of like a lesson that they learned, or anytime that you experienced something and you learned, oh, that works or that doesn't work, it's the same concept in qualitative research, that just because there's not numbers behind it doesn't mean that there's not value to it. So I'm going to do a couple more videos on the types of data that we collect and the types of approaches that there are in qualitative research. As many of you know, I teach several courses on qualitative research. I teach an Introduction to Qualitative Research course in the spring and in the summer. It's online in the summer, face-to-face in the spring, where the whole course is an introduction to this. And then I also teach an advanced qualitative research course, and I teach multiple smaller courses on specific types of qualitative research. All of that to say that trying to pack all of that into 1 week is incredibly difficult. So what we're going to focus on here is the big ideas. What is the goal of qualitative research? What does qualitative research look like? And kind of what is some of that variety in there? How do I know what a good qualitative research study looks like? So I'm going to do that in a few more videos. If you have any questions on this, let me know and I will be happy to help. If not, I will see you in the next video.